Welcome to SmokeGuard's AIA Continuing Education series. Today's AIA course is titled Fire and Smoke Requirements for Residential. This course has been approved for one learning unit for health, safety, and welfare with the American Institute of Architects. SmokeGuard is part of the Engineered Building Solutions Group, a segment of CSW Industrials. The EBS Group unites Balco, Metacock, SmokeGuard, and Greco. These four leading brands provide innovative, safety-focused solutions for architects, building owners, engineers, and contractors with a shared commitment to life safety by design. SmokeGuard offers flexible, visually appealing fire and smoke protection systems designed to cover everything from small openings to large atrium spaces. SmokeGuard offers a full line of elevator smoke containment systems, including vertical, horizontal, and perimeter fire and smoke curtains, as well as shutter and static curtain solutions. SmokeGuard is a registered provider with the American Institute of Architects CES program. This course is approved and in compliance with AIA. This program is not intended to promote any specific construction material or method of use. At the completion of this video course, you will need to take our 10-question test and get 70% correct to receive your AIA Certificate of Completion. You will receive your certificate via email. If you are an AIA member and you provided your member number, we will report your course completion to AIA for credit. Please allow for up to 10 business days to report credit to AIA. This presentation is copyrighted by SmokeGuard. Any reproduction, distribution, display, or use is prohibited without written permission. In this course, you will learn the purpose and function of key building elements and how they impact egress in residential facilities, review IBC requirements related to smoke and fire protection, explore the pros and cons of various design solutions, and gain awareness of common pitfalls and special considerations in smoke protection design. This presentation was pre-recorded by David Bauer. David is the Architectural Director for SmokeGuard. With that, let's turn it over to David.
Okay, first question that we'd ask is, why use fabric? I mean, I've personally used steel systems forever. Probably most of us have. Why not just use steel? There's nothing wrong with it. It satisfies the code requirement. Well, maybe we can do things in a better way. We used to ride horses too. We drive cars now. We still get to our destination with a horse. This might be a better way to do it though. So this project was one of mine dozen plus years ago. And it's a corridor in a hospital. And if you're not familiar with hospitals, corridor walls in hospitals have to be smoke rated. So openings in the corridor walls have to be smoke rated. So I needed a smoke rated system, not a fire rated system. So I put a coiling steel system in here. Not the wrong answer. It was fine. You're not wrong if you do that. However, it was about a 22-inch square housing. And it was up in the ceiling of a hospital where there's everything known to mankind running through the ceiling of that hospital. And I had to reroute everything. It wasn't a major problem in my mind because I knew I had to do that. But today we go in and we use a fabric system that has about a 6-inch housing. So it's approximately a third the size. And it's, with respect to structural reinforcement, it's a weightless system. I've never seen one of these systems have to be reinforced structurally to be able to handle the load of a fabric curtain. So that's why I use fabric. We can do the same thing, come to the same solutions, just in a much easier and more efficient and effective way. Okay, before we get too far down the road, it's important that we talk about rated walls. So there are 5 different types of rated walls in the IBC, and 4 of them are fire rated, 3 of them are smoke rated, and then there's that overlap in the middle between the 2 of them. So the distinction between them is not necessarily always going to be the construction of the wall, but the location in which the wall is, or the job that it's doing. So fire barriers, just to take one example, and we'll relate this to residential occupancies. Fire barriers are what we use to build shafts. So if we have an elevator, we are going to construct the walls of that elevator shaft with fire barriers. It is fire rated. It is not smoke rated. So that's important, particularly when we're talking about residential occupancies and vertical openings, such as elevator shafts, because that door is not going to be smoke rated either. So a fire partition wall, a 1-hour fire partition, a 1-hour smoke barrier can be constructed with the exact same assembly type, exactly the same, no distinctions. The distinctions are in the openings. So firewalls and fire barriers are limited to 25% openings. Fire partitions, smoke barriers, and smoke partitions, they're unlimited. So it's kind of big leap there from 25% to no limit. So what does that mean to us? Well, you got to be cautious because you got to be very cognizant of what that 1 hour wall is. That 1 hour wall being a fire barrier or that 1 hour wall being a fire partition has a very big distinction in terms of what openings you can put in there. There's another section of the code, it's been in the code forever. I don't know about forever, but for a long time, multiple generations. And that's the requirement for multiple use fire assemblies. So here's the question, that dashed in box in the middle, what does that wall have to be constructed to meet? The corridor with the blue walls is smoke rated. And then that, let's say it's a shaft with the red walls, that's fire rated. But the smoke rated corridor is not fire rated and the fire rated shaft is not smoke rated. So what does that section of wall have to be? Well, because of multiple use fire assemblies, it's required to be rated to both the qualifications of the corridor and the shaft. So that section of wall has to be both 2 hour fire rated and smoke rated also. This doesn't get too complicated until you start putting openings in that, however. Now, what about residential occupancies? Little housekeeping here. If you see that little legend down the left-hand corner, that's going to tell you what type of wall we're talking about. And also, there may be some benefit if you get a PDF of this program, anything underlined is hyperlinked. So that can take you to a little more detail on some of these things. But in this case, in a residential occupancy with corridors, we'll get ahead of the curve here a little bit. Corridors have to be fire and smoke rated because those are fire partitions. Again, it's very important that you know that that's a fire partition and not just a 1 hour rated wall. So that section of wall right there in the middle, that is both part of the fire barrier and part of the fire partition, because of multiple use fire assemblies, is required to comply with the requirements for both. It is not a condition in which we say the more restrictive of the two governs. That's incorrect. It's got to be the collective of all of those requirements that governs, not the greater of the two, which implies a choice. So if this was an elevator shaft, we already have 90-minute doors in there because by virtue of the elevator doors, but we don't have a smoke rating on there. Again, we're getting a little ahead of the curve on what that smoke rating is, but there's a little teaser right there. But you'd have to provide that smoke rating, not because of the shaft, not because of the fire barrier, but because of the corridor, because of the fire partition. So be conscious of what types of walls those are, not just that they're 1 hour rated. So have any of you ever read the elevator code? I read it for the first time probably about maybe 8 to 10 years ago. But in active day-to-day practice, I never had. There's some stuff in there that is really important to know. It's referenced in the IBC. So we need to know what's in it. We're responsible for that information. Part of what's in that information ties into this thing that we put out in front of elevators and in elevators. In case of fire, don't use elevators, use the stairs. Well, why would we even need to talk about that if when the building goes into alarm, the elevator goes into phase 1 emergency recall? Because when the building goes into alarm, the elevator does not go into phase 1 emergency recall. Phase 1 emergency recall, if you're familiar with that, the elevator goes down to the ground floor and the doors lock open, is only triggered by the smoke detectors associated with that particular elevator. So if we're looking at a residential occupancy, say we have a R occupancy encircling an S occupancy or a parking deck, 4-story, 5-story, whatever it is. But we will likely have elevators in multiple locations. Those will only sequentially go into phase 1 emergency recall as smoke reaches those elevators. It is not because of general alarm. So we put this in there so that somebody doesn't get into that elevator, which is fully functioning in the middle of a general alarm condition, strobes and horns, everything's happening. But you get in that elevator, you go down. While you're in that elevator, smoke finally makes it to that elevator shaft, and you're in it. We don't want that. Bad procedure. This is the document. You should know. The licensed architects among you, you'll need to know what this is because it's referenced in the IBC. Everybody else should. You may not know every word in it. You don't need to, but it is a reference document in there to the same degree that an FPA 105 or an FPA 80 is. So let's talk about first elevator hoistway door protections. We're going to go through a couple different vertical openings here that apply in most R occupancies. And this is in section 3006.2. This is the section that is labeled elevator and conveying systems. If we go to chapter 30, you look at that and you're like, well, this is where all the elevator stuff is. Well, here's a clue. All the elevator stuff is not in chapter 30, but this could very well be the first place you look, and that's not the wrong thing to do. So we'll look there from the perspective of the elevator. But if you remember that wall that is shared between the elevator shaft and the corridor, that wall is part of the corridor and of the elevator shaft. So we're going to look first from the perspective of the elevator shaft, but don't forget that that corridor wall is also part of the corridor. So that's something else we're going to need to look at. We'll look at that in a moment, but this is just from the perspective of the elevator. So when you have an R occupancy, you have to have a smoke protection from this section. You have to have smoke protection if the building is a high rise and if the elevator connects more than 75 feet from the lowest to the highest occupied level. There are a couple exceptions to that. One is you don't have to have it to the level of exit discharge. Why? Because those doors lock open in a fire anyway. And smoke protection is not required where the elevator is open to the exterior. Now, it's real important to note here that those exceptions are relative to this section. Those aren't universal exceptions on page 1 of the IBC. Those exceptions are only relative to section 3006.2. So you can't just universally say, well, you never have to ever have to have smoke protection where it's at the level of exit discharge. In some cases, you may. So we're going to explore why you might at some point, as we go through this presentation. So you can do an elevator lobby. So 306.2 tells you when you have to do it. 306.3 gives you your options on what your solutions are to the problem. So if you look at the first one, you notice the first one is option number 1, or not option number 2. Option number 1 is for buildings that are non-sprinklered. We're going to kind of gloss over that for our purposes today. But if you look at option number 2 for fully sprinklered buildings, which most everything we touch is exactly that, you only have to put in a smoke-rated elevator lobby. And it defines the fact that you have to construct your smoke-rated elevator lobby with smoke partitions. Now, if you remember that rated wall page a while back, smoke partitions are not fire rated, they're only smoke rated. And there is no limit to the size of the door relative to the wall in a smoke partition. So, for example, you maybe have a 6-foot section of wall right there. You can have a 6-foot door in that if you'd like. Could be 8 feet. You could have 6-foot doors, 7-foot pair of doors, a lot of different options that you have in front of you, but you're not limited by that at all. So this is a pretty simple solution. We see this pretty frequently. In residential occupancies, however, there's a twist. So one of the things that we need to keep in mind, the prior slide told us what we have to do in general in buildings from the perspective of the elevator lobby. But you have to recall that or residential corridors are 1 hour fire rated and constrained within 1 hour fire partitions. Fire partitions, again, are smoke and fire rated. Openings in it have to be smoke and fire rated. So the requirement for that is a 20-minute UL 1784 listed door. Now, if you're scratching your head thinking, what in the world is UL 1784? If you note on your door schedule that you have a door and it has to have an S label, it's the same thing. It's more convenient to just put S on a door schedule and write out UL 1784. Plus the fact that UL 1784 is a test methodology, it's a test standard. It describes how you test a system. What it doesn't tell you is what the allowable leakage is. That's in the building code. But when you say S label, that covers both of those. So that's a perfectly valid description. But that is what the root meaning of that is, UL 1784. And we've got one more little twist on that in a moment that we'll get to, and we'll talk about that as well. You could have this as an elevator lobby. This is totally viable. We see this all the time, particularly in residential occupancies, particularly in 3- and 4-story hotels. You can pass through the lobby. It's a viable egress path to go through a lobby, one of the few spaces you can go through in a building. But be conscious about what that does to your doors. So look at this picture for just a second and think, what is wrong with this picture? There are a few things wrong, only a few of which you can see. But if you look at the door swings, from where we stand here, we see that far exit sign down the other end of the hallway. We know that's our exit path. We know inherently that there is one behind us somewhere as well, once we get to an occupancy of 50 or more. So we know that one of our exit paths from where we stand right now in this picture has to be towards that exit in the distance. And we're going through this pair of doors in the foreground. Everything's fine. They have panic hardware on there. The doors are swinging in the proper direction. Everything's fine. Until you get to the far side of the lobby, and then those doors swing against the direction of travel. Well, that's not going to work out. So let's just reverse all the doors. Well, then we have the problem going the other way. The reality is the solution in this has to be biparting doors, a leaf that swings in each direction in order to get through this lobby either direction of travel. What else might be wrong with this? If you think back to the previous slides, what's the listing on this door have to be? It has to be smoke rated. It does not have to be fire rated. Now, the reality is to put in a smoke rated door, they're almost always going to be fire rated anyway, but that's not the requirement in the code. The requirement is only for smoke. So what does that little label say right there? Let's take a look at it. We have a 1 hour fire rated door with no smoke rating. What's the requirement in this location? We learned that a moment ago, 20-minute fire rating and S label or UL 1784 smoke tested. And this gives us an hour rating. Well, that's great. That's wonderful. I mean, over and above, that's good. Delivered more than you promised. Terrific. But we have to have the S label in order to make this a viable smoke lobby. So we don't have that. So this does not get a passing grade in terms of the AHJ, who clearly did give this a passing grade, but maybe he was having an off day. Keep in mind, too, labels can be on top of doors. They don't necessarily have to be on the spine of the door. This is something I was unaware of until a couple of years ago. And a fire protection engineer friend of mine explained this to me. And I said, get out of here. I didn't believe him. And so I went to my father's residential occupancy. He walked into his front door that had been annoying me for years because it didn't have a labeled door. So I reached in there, felt a little across the top of the door, and there was this, a label. I thought, oh my goodness, look at this. We do have a labeled door. And I've been angry at this whole apartment complex for all these years because they had unrated doors. Of course, then I took a picture of the label, and it's not a listed door after all, because you can't paint over a label and have it remain a valid listed product. So also the only example on planet Earth in which a painter actually painted the top of the door. So I thought pretty special for having witnessed that. Additional doors. This is the next option past lobbies. Additional doors. Now you think to yourself, what does that mean, additional doors? You put another door in front of the elevator door? Well, yeah, that's exactly what you do. And it may look something like this. Now, that's not the prettiest solution in the world. And scratch your head a moment and think, what happens if you actually have 3 elevators in that shaft? Where do you put the other door? Where does the center door swing to? Well, you can just supersize the elevator shaft a little bit and make room for it. Well, doing that costs money, costs space. So you're not going to do that either. So it becomes a problem when you get the multiple elevators in a single shaft. This would work, though, doesn't it? Well, remember we talked about the elevator code a little while ago? There's some stuff in the elevator code that we need to know. We talked about that briefly, but let me tell you what those things are right now. Any door in front of an elevator door has to have visibility through that door. Now, the elevator code does not do a very good job defining what that means, but it does have to have visibility through it, and this is for the safety of firefighters. So you can scratch your head and wonder, well, is that a half light, a full light? Is it a 10 by 10 window? There is no correct or incorrect answer to that. My suggestion might be that you probably want bigger rather than smaller, just to err on the side of caution. But this door would have to have a view panel through it. The other thing that's very, very hard to see, this was remember I mentioned that gotcha on UL 1784, there was a little teaser in there. UL 1784 tests can be done 2 different ways. One is tested without an artificial bottom seal. And you think to yourself, well, what was the alternative to that? The alternative to that is testing with an artificial bottom seal. And if the image in your mind is of a roll of duct tape and taping the bottom of the door, that's exactly what they do. That is totally in play for testing doors. However, it is tested with an artificial bottom seal then. Any door immediately in front of an elevator is required to be tested without an artificial bottom seal. So an important distinction, you can't realistically do that with a slab door. I've never seen a slab door that qualifies for that. Now, I've seen integrated doors that do that, and I have seen other things that do that we're going to talk about in just a minute. Here's another example of a door in front of a door, an additional door in front of an elevator. There's something wrong with this picture too. If you haven't caught it, we'll go ahead and bypass this slide, but come back to it if you haven't figured it out yet. Third option that you have. This is another option available to you in the International Building Code, and this is elevator shaft pressurization. This example, there are many, many examples, but this is one example at University of Wisconsin where a shaft pressurization system was used in a 9-story building, which is easier to successfully test it in than it would be in a 20-story building. but they could not successfully test this system. And it's based on mechanical systems. You've got fans, you've got ducts, you've got all kinds of other stuff going on. And if it doesn't all work properly and remain in balance such that the elevator doors can be demonstrated to open and close properly under certain pressure parameters, you can't pass that test. This building fell into that problem scenario. And they had to relocate all of the classes for the fall semester 2.5 years ago. Here's another example, just be kind of quick on this one. This is a adaptive reuse of a 12-story building built in 1928. And in this case, they attempted to use shaft pressurization. They couldn't make it work either. At the end of the day, in order to get their CO, there was one thing left that they had to accomplish on their certificate of occupancy, and it was their smoke protection system for the elevator. And they could not do it with the shaft pressurization system at the last minute. They used a certain type of additional doors. So let's talk about those types of additional doors. Today, they've been broken out into an additional category. So this is option number 5 in the current code, in the 2024 code, and they're referred to as smoke protected curtain assemblies. These have been around for a long time, a full generation, but they were under the category of additional doors. Now they have their own category since they're so prominent out there. So smoke protected curtain assemblies, how is that ever an additional door to begin with? Well, we put them right in front of the elevator door. So they may look like this. There are 2 general families that these fall into. Scrutinize these. Look at the listing. Make sure that you understand all the particulars that you have to accomplish to remain in accordance with the code, because you have to do that. This type has been around for a long time. This is a roll-down transparent magnet-based system. So this remains up in the housing that you can see up above until, ideally, the smoke detector is triggered. You know, that same smoke detector that puts the elevator into phase 1 recall. Then it begins to deploy. So the building can be in general alarm, and this would stay retracted, ideally. It can work the other way, but that's probably not the recommended way, because we want these systems to remain in concert with the function of the elevator. So it's just simpler too. So what do we have to have? We have to have visibility through it. Do we have that? Yes, we do. Anytime we have the potential of having someone encapsulated or captured in a space, such as an elevator, they've got to get out of there. Well, there's a button on this, you can rewind it, right? But what happens when you have any kind of a powered door in a building that's required for you as part of your egress path? You also have to have a manual means to get through that. So this system does have a manual means to get through that. What is that? You just push through it and the magnets release. Very, very simple, very straightforward. This has been around for 30 plus years, and it substantively has not changed. Very ahead of the curve, and still a little bit ahead of the curve. This is what it might look like. So when we have a building like this, you can open up the lobby that you otherwise would have had it to have closed if you'd stuck with option 2. But in this case, this tenant in particular took a whole floor. But what we don't have is an obstruction to travel through this lobby. So remember that hotel we looked at a while ago? We had to pass through that lobby. This one, I see an exit sign out there. We'd have to pass through this lobby as well to get to that exit. Well, if this were an enclosed lobby, we're having to go through those doors. Do we want to do that? Well, sure, we can do that. But do we want to? Is that our option, our ultimate option? No, I would say that you'd rather have nothing in the way than something in the way. So smoke protected curtain assemblies have another variant as well. So there's the magnetic curtain assembly, magnetic based systems, and then there are also the track based systems. The track based systems have come a long way in the last probably dozen years or so. A dozen years ago, there were some questionable systems out there. Even as recently as 4 or 5 years ago, there's some questionable ones. There were also some good ones. There are many good ones now. These have come a long way. Like I said, the same rules apply. You can have powered egress, certainly, but you have to have a manual means of egress through these. You have to have visibility through these and to remain in concert with the elevator code. And since we probably have not read the elevator code or not particularly aware of the elevator code, and the AHJ or the field inspector may not be aware of the elevator code, they might sign off on everything you have out there. And if we put the wrong device in there without visibility through it, who do you think is going to catch that? It's going to be the elevator inspector. You know, the guy you've never met, the guy you don't know, and the guy that shows up 2 days before CO, him. And that's a bad place to be. So we don't want that. So make sure that you're aware of those stipulations in the elevator code. Fire service access elevators, elevator lobbies have been a requirement in the code for a while. There are some particulars. If you have a building with an occupied floor over 120 feet above the lowest level of fire department vehicular access, you have to have a fire service access elevator lobby. Now, this may be waived in renovations. I'm aware of several right now that are ongoing that we're working on that they have waived that requirement for it. But in new construction, this is a requirement. So what do we have to do for a fire service access elevator lobby? Let's look at it in graphic form first. So the first thing you might notice, if you recall back, that elevator lobbies in a residential occupancy are required to be, if it's sprinklered, are required to be separated by smoke partitions. In a fire service access elevator lobby, they're required to be separated by smoke barriers. What's the difference between smoke barriers and smoke partitions? Smoke barriers have a fire rating in addition to their smoke rating. So that is a 1 hour smoke barrier enclosing that lobby. And the reason is because the firefighters will use that as they come into the building and stage for however they're fighting the fire from behind that protection. So that red area is a protected area. The opening is unique. If you look at the requirements in chapter 716 for openings in smoke partitions, you're going to see that the requirement is 20-minute smoke rated. This is an exception. This is 45-minute smoke rated. But let's look at the egress requirements also. So we have kind of standard doors elsewhere. The unique requirement here also, not to bypass this, is that it has to be tested without an artificial bottom seal. I've read these sections of the codes a couple thousand times, and I'm not aware of any place other than that location that we're showing or immediately in front of the elevator where testing is required without an artificial bottom seal. Be very, very cautious about that. You can't get that in slab doors. So what happens when we need to egress the building? The building goes into alarm. Depending on where you are, you might follow any one of these paths. And notice where they don't pass through. They don't pass through that entry door into the elevator lobby. Now, if you're a firefighter, what are you doing? Something similar, but not the same. You're going to use that red area there in the middle, the fire service access elevator lobby, as your staging area. That's your command post. You'll have a med station there. You'll store our O2 bottles there. And they will address the fire from a floor or 2 floors below the fire floor. So they'll go into the stair, they'll access the standpipe and go up and fight the fire of the floor above where they stage to. This is pretty much a floor or 2 floors below is pretty much a universal process for fire departments if they choose to use the elevator lobby. And they can use the elevator or not at their discretion. Okay. Now that part of the description of smoke protection at elevators is pretty universal. We talked about rated walls, which are present in residential occupancies, and they may not be present in business occupancies. But let's take a look at just the corridor rating requirements. So we talked about how that front wall of the elevator shaft is part of the elevator shaft and part of the corridor. We talked about the requirements for the elevator shaft, but immaterial, even regardless of what that space is behind that opening, and we've been discussing elevator shafts, regardless of what that space is, it's still an opening in a fire partition. And we have to satisfy the requirements for an opening in a fire partition. The requirements for that, 20-minute and smoke rated as well. So, and this is a table that we all are probably very, very familiar with. And those walls, this is where it tells you that the walls had to be constructed as fire partitions. So what does this mean? So this is our corridor. It doesn't make any difference if that is an elevator shaft or if that is anything. It could be a dwelling unit. It could be a hotel room. It could be an apartment, a condo, a dorm. It doesn't make any difference. It's still a residential occupancy, and it still has fire partitions defining the corridor. If you poke a hole in a fire partition, once again, you have a 90-minute door for the elevator already, so you don't need to provide any kind of a fire rating. It's already there. But you do have to provide a smoke rating. We've just done this on every unit door, just as you see to the right of the screen there. Every door that we have is 20-minute smoke rated. And we like to be cryptic by putting UL 1784 there. But again, like we discussed earlier, that can just be an S label, and that's a perfectly valid description. So if we put in a smoke rated elevator lobby in a residential occupancy, what does that opening into the corridor have to be? It has to be 20-minute UL 1784. We discussed that a little bit earlier, but this is where that comes from. So how about this? Look at that elevator door. See the little number on the jamb? It's first floor. It's level of exit discharge. It's got the little star on it. Why did they put why did they put smoke protection, as weak as it may be in this case, in front of the elevator doors on the level of exit discharge? You remember in chapter 30, there's an exception that says the level of exit discharge is not required to be protected. That's great, and that's true. But that is only relative to the requirements in chapter 30. It has nothing to do with the requirements for openings and fire partitions. Since there is no separation from the corridor that we see back there with the blue walls and this elevator lobby, which leads to the front door, since there's no separation there, this is part of the corridor. Those walls, in addition to being a 1 hour fire barrier, are also 1 hour fire partition. The openings in the fire partition require a smoke rating. Those doors are there to provide that smoke rating. Now, once again, let's hope that the label was on top of the door because it's not on the spine. However, we do see that it's a slab door, and I'm still looking for my first slab door after a dozen years of looking at these kind of things, and I've not found one that's tested without an artificial bottom seal yet. So that has to be tested without an artificial bottom seal. Is it? Well, we don't even know that it's tested. Of course, I took the slide before I knew to look on top of the door. It doesn't have a view window in it, so there's no visibility through it. Again, it doesn't require half light. We don't know what it requires because the elevator code doesn't make it clear, but I would err on the side of caution depending on what the interpretation of the elevator inspector might be that day. Let's look at a different type of vertical opening. Let's look at atriums. So atriums have changed their definition over the years. Prior to the 2018 IBC, you could have a residential occupancy with a 2-story volume in it, and it could be considered an atrium. Now, with the new definition, that 2-story volume is no longer an atrium. It has to be something else. We'll talk about what these alternatives could be in a moment. But an atrium begins with 3 stories now with the new definition, with the exception of hospitals and jails. So we have a little bit of a different scenario here. However, the end result of this, the constructed building, ends up being the same. It really just gives us a different path to get there. But the terms that you use, they have to be different terms. So if you have a 4-story volume, let's just take this for a quick example. 4-story volume, we're going to call it an atrium. It fits the definition today. It fit the definition before. First thing you read in section 404.6, well, actually, the first thing you read might be 404.1. But the interesting stuff is in 404.6 and 404.5. We're going to do 404.6 first, talks about enclosure of atriums. The first things that you read in enclosure of atriums is that it has to be separated by 1 hour fire barrier. Well, this is pretty horrible. Not because fire barriers are uncommon. They're common. It's 1 hour rated wall. It's not smoke rated. That part's easy. But remember, very, very early in this presentation, we talked about the limitation of openings in a fire barrier. If we have a fire barrier, say there's a 20-foot wall on each side of a square atrium, the most that we can put in there is what, 6 feet 3 inches of total opening in any one of those fire barriers. So this limits our exposure to the atrium, limits the experience of an atrium, really limits what the atrium is intended to do to begin with. So if you don't read exceptions, this is what you're stuck with. However, we're going to read the exceptions. So exception 1 permits substitution of sprinkler protected glass forming a smoke partition. Those are the words that the code uses. The code does not arbitrarily use words like smoke partition, and they italicize it, which takes you back to the definition. If they use a term, they mean that term, and it's defined in the code. So you can use sprinkler protected glass. This is only a smoke rated system substituting for what is only a fire rated system. But it is a specific allowance in the code, so you can substitute that. Let's keep reading exceptions because these things are pretty good. Let's get down to exception number 5. It says that 3 stories of the atrium can remain unenclosed. Okay, well, that's good. What if you had a 3-story atrium? You do nothing, and you've satisfied the requirement for enclosure. Now, it does say that you have to still take into consideration all those parameters in the smoke control solution. Smoke control is still on the table. We haven't dealt with it yet. But we can have in this 4-story atrium enclosure on only 1 floor. Okay, well, that's much better. Now let's take a look at the smoke control requirements in section 404.5. First thing it says is you have to install a smoke control solution or a smoke control system in accordance with section 909. Okay, here we go. Big roundabout. Now we're going to another section. Bottom line is smoke control systems can take a variety of shapes. They can be an active system or a mechanical system, or they can be a passive system using fabric curtains or some other passive device. Either one is completely in play. However, either one of them still has to comply with the requirements of Section 909. So how do we do that? Well, let's say that we're going to use an old school mechanical system. This isn't wrong. We've probably seen this over and over again. We can put in a mechanical smoke evacuation system that's going to pull all the smoke out of there. However, if you don't introduce fresh air into that space, it's going to stop working really fast, or you'll create a vacuum in that space, which it won't do. So you have to have a means of getting fresh air in there approximately in the ratio of 1-to-1. It's a little different than that, but it has to pull in nearly as much air as it exhausts smoke in order to keep that flow moving. And it has to keep the smoke 6 feet or more away from any surface required for egress. So you essentially diagrammatically would end up with something that looks like this. What's harder to diagram is the amount of money it costs to do this. That's pretty extreme. So what if we put a floor protected by curtains that are not required to be there? Remember, you can keep three stories open to an atrium and open to the adjacent spaces, and that only has to be sprinkler protected glass or an alternate smoke partition. Remember, the code says sprinkler protected glass forming a smoke partition. There are lots of things could be smoke partitions or openings in smoke partitions. So what if you put a layer of curtains on the third floor here and kept your sprinkler protected glass on the fourth floor? Or what if you got rid of the sprinkler protected glass and put curtains on both floors? What do those curtains have to do? They have to be smoke rated such that they comply with the requirements for an opening in a smoke partition. And remember, the openings in a smoke partition are not limited by size or percentage. So you could do something like this, but why would we do that? We just spent more than $0 on those curtains on the third floor. Why would we do that? Well, we would do that because it made the smoke exhaust system that much smaller. So the market has shown us that the ratio of savings is in the neighborhood of 3-to-1. Spend $1 on a curtain, probably save about 3 on mechanical. The numbers are actually bigger than that. That's a ratio, obviously. So what if you did another floor? Same thing. Let's do the same thing down a little bit further. We have dramatically decreased the volume requirement for that atrium to exhaust that smoke. So again, we have probably saved 1-to-3 in terms of ratio of dollars. Spend $1,000 on those 2 sets of curtains, $2,000, whatever the number is. You'll probably save triple that in the mechanical system. Okay, this is all good so far. Well, something new was introduced into the code in 2021. It's also in 2024 code. And this gives you an out, a way to completely eliminate the smoke control system. And this seems pretty simple. All stories above the lowest 2 have to be constructed as a shaft. Well, this is pretty straightforward. Let's just do that. And then we don't have to have a smoke control system at all. So yeah, we're saving a ratio of 3-to-1 if we do what we were talking about. We can save all of it if we do this. Just get rid of it. Okay, what happens if we do that? You end up with something like this. The bottom 2 floors are permitted to remain completely open. The top 2 floors have to be constructed as per a shaft. Now think back about the requirement for a shaft. You have to build it with fire barriers, fire rated, not smoke rated. You're limited to 25% openings. Okay, that's not great. In this 4-story application, what is the construction requirement in terms of the wall rating for the shaft? It's 2-hour rating. So we have 2-hour shaft on floors 3 and 4, the construction that would be identical to that for a 2-hour shaft. And the requirements for a shaft, and it just says you have to construct this as you would a shaft. You can't have openings that are not required for the function of the shaft in a shaft. To punch through that fire barrier into that space, technically you're not allowed to have anything that isn't necessary for the function of that space. You think about it, we don't have arbitrary openings in elevator shafts, in stair shafts, interior exit stairways, don't have view windows that open out into the adjacent space. So we have to put in fire barriers. We have to limit our openings to 25% of the wall. We have to put in fire dampers in every penetration through there. And we have to do all of this. And then we end up with an atrium that isn't really much of an atrium. So weigh this amongst yourselves and think to yourself, is this really worth doing? What we see in the marketplace in the 4 or 5 years since this has been out is we just don't see it. And I think that's because the penalty paid is probably too high relative to the savings. So let's talk about passive smoke control. So we know that the enclosure requirements tell us that you can leave 3 floors open. So we've done that, but now we've enclosed 2 more floors. What do we actually have here? We still have a 4-story atrium because we don't have fire-rated, 1-hour fire-rated fire barrier construction separating the atrium from the adjacent spaces. It is a 4-story atrium. But in this case, the only requirement that we have to provide is enclosure of 1 floor with smoke partitions. And the only purpose of us putting the other fabric curtains around this space is to provide for our means of smoke control. So what do we have? The purpose of those 2 second floor and third floor curtains are only for smoke control. They're only required to be smoke rated. And do we actually have an atmospheric connection between any 2 floors? What we see frequently is separation of all but 2 floors. But what we also see fairly commonly is separation of 3. In either case, what we provided for is no atmospheric connection from floor to floor. Smoke does not know that this is a 4-story atrium. Smoke's not all that smart, although it's kind of sneaky. It thinks that this is a tall 1-story space. It can't get to any other floor, provided you have smoke-rated separation there. This is a passive system. Before we were talking about how passive systems could aid an active system. So fabric curtains might help you diminish the size of a mechanical smoke evacuation system, and our savings were about 3 to 1. If we can eliminate that system altogether, our savings have pretty much tripled, and they're right in the neighborhood of 9 to 1. So what if we have a corridor? Now we could have this in a business occupancy, and you have to do virtually nothing. We're not talking about business occupancies. We're talking about residential occupancies. What is the required construction for that corridor right there, if it is coincidental with the edge of the atrium? Well, remember, corridors have to be constructed with fire partitions. So those are fire partitions now separating the corridor from the adjacent spaces and separating the corridor from the atrium. Remember, the corridor is protected with 1-hour fire partitions. Can you put openings in those? Sure can. Let's leave the realm of atriums for a moment. Let's say we have a 2-story application. We can no longer call that an atrium. If we had a 2-story volume or vertical opening prior to the 2021 IBC, we could have called that an atrium. And it would give you a further stipulation you don't require smoke control. Now, in the 2021 and newer codes, that can only be defined as a 2-story opening. So what do we do with this 2-story opening? Can we do this in a residential occupancy? Well, there's no prohibition to it per se. However, if we have a corridor right there, what do we do there? Same answer as before. That corridor is constructed with fire partitions. We have to provide that separation. Remember, that opening that you may want between like the second floor occupant of the corridor and the overall 2-story opening, you can have that open because there can be operable fire partition openings, provided they comply with the requirements for fire partition openings. And what is that? There's no limitation on the percentage of width. You can have a 20-foot bay and you can have a 20-foot opening. There's no limit on that. So you can have a big wide opening. What does it have to be? It has to be 20-minute UL10B rated and smoke rated also, both of those. Exactly the same as a unit door into a hotel room, into a dorm room, has the exact same rating, because we know that those can be valid openings in fire partitions. Let's look at exit access stairways. So not too many changes in here, but you can put an exit access stairway within a 2-story opening. So if we have a 2-story volume, we can do that. We can put it inside an atrium. So if we have a 3-4-story volume, we can do that. So we can do something like this. In the code says that you can penetrate up to 4 floors if you provide draft curtains around that slab penetration. But again, if you open to a corridor in a residential occupancy, you still have to provide protection for that corridor. So think back about this. Probably the most important thing to be cognizant of in the IBC is the importance of section 1020.2. And that's what tells you whether you have to have rated walls or you don't have to have rated walls, depending on your occupancy type. For residential occupancies, you do have to have 1-hour rated walls. Those 1-hour rated walls also have to have a 20-minute fire rated opening in them. And that fire rated opening, a 20-minute fire rated opening, has to be tested to UL 1784 or the same thing, have an S label assigned to it. So be very cautious about those things.
This concludes our AIA Continuing Education On-Demand presentation. On behalf of SmokeGuard and the EBS Group, thank you for your time and attention. As a reminder, you'll need to complete a 10-question test to receive credit for this course. Simply click the test button below to get started. After completing and passing the test, you will receive your AIA Certificate of Completion by email to the address you provided before taking the test. If you're an AIA member and you provided your member number, we'll submit your credit directly to AIA on your behalf. Please allow up to 10 business days for your credit to appear on your AIA transcript. To recap, SmokeGuard's core offerings include standard and custom elevator smoke containment solutions and vertical, horizontal, and perimeter fire and smoke curtains. If you would like information on any of our products, design support, or additional AIA presentations, you can contact our support team or visit our website. Additionally, the EBS Group offers AIA-approved courses on life safety products. Balco covers expansion joints, photoluminescent egress systems, and fire stopping. SmokeGuard focuses on fire and smoke protection solutions, and Greco offers courses on commercial architectural railings and code compliance. Scan the QR codes or visit their websites to explore all available courses. If you have any questions or would like more information on SmokeGuard, visit our website at www.smokeguard.com. Thank you again for your time and interest. We look forward to seeing you on our next AIA On Demand video presentation.